We're going to look at several different ideas on the parsha, which I think come together in broad terms, to a theme which is about developing a personal connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is a obviously very complex idea, but it's particularly important in Parshas Yisro because Parshas Yisro is the parsha of Ma'amad Har Sinai, of Matan Torah, and the picture that we have in our minds is that as a mimer, the idea that all of Klal Yisrael, all the Jewish people are gathered together, whereas the element of the personal, of the connection on an individual level. We focus a lot on the concept of Ki Ish Echad B'Lev Echad, the whole idea that it is one, we are all one. And the question is, where is the Ish Echad in that? Where is the individual that exists within the Ki Ish Echad? Does that make sense? Yeah, that's the question. Let's begin with an idea of Shimon Schwab, Ma'ames Sheva. If you look at Perek Yud Ches, Posuk Yud, so the beginning of the parsha, it's a question which others ask as well. He's not the first to ask the question. If we just look at Rashi on Posuk Yud, Yud Ches Yud Yisro, Yisro says after meeting, and Moshe Rabbeinu tells him everything that's happened, and he's very happy. Pasuk Yud Vayomer Yisro. Yisro says Baruch Hashem Asher Tzileschem Miyad Mitzrayim Miyad Paroi. That he blesses HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Baruch Hashem Tzileschem, who saved you from all of these terrible threats that you faced. Asher Tzileschem Mitachas Yad Mitzrayim, from underneath the hand of Mitzrayim. And this is actually not brought by Rashi, but the Medrash says, the Mechilta says that this pasuk is to the detriment, B'Gnusun Shel Yisrael. It reflects negatively on the Jewish people. Right? And there's a similar Gemara in Sanhedrin as well, that from the time when they left Mitzrayim, no one said these words, Baruch Hashem. No one said the words Baruch Hashem. Yisro is the first one who turns around and says, Baruch Hashem. Thank God, you've been saved. And the question is obvious. What is the idea of the words Baruch Hashem? What does that mean? At the end of the day, they said Shira. They said Shira. You can't get a greater Baruch Hashem than that, right? The whole of the Shira that they sang after the cursing of the Yam Suf, that was the greatest Baruch Hashem there is. What was the idea that no one said Baruch Hashem until Yisro came along and said Baruch Hashem? So he says like this: the idea is that the concept of a Shira, and particularly if you think of the Shira Hayam, is very much a public thing. It's a Shira LaRabbim. It's very much for the public. But the concept of expressing the words Baruch Hashem is an individual expression. It's a personal expression. And he says that's why in davening we say that when we say Baruch Hu, what does it mean? He says, when we say Baruch Hu, the Shliach Tzivah says Baruch Hu, that means together, you together, plural, right? Es Hashem HaMavorach. That means to say, it should be in the mouth. We want the Shliach Tzibah is encouraging each individual to say Baruch Hu. And what is the response? The individual response is Baruch. Baruch Hashem HaMavorach. That's the difference. So the Shliach Tzibah says Baruch Hu in the plural, and the response is individual. Baruch Hashem HaMavorach. In other words, there's an individual response to the collective call that the Chazan, the Shliach Tzibah makes. And this is the kalein. This is the so to speak, the criticism. But why was it that no one until that moment expressed as an individual the words Baruch Hashem? Now, of course, this is obviously this makes the question even stronger. So why was it that no one expressed on a personal level that a sense of gratitude in that level? And Rav Schwab says like this. He says that the derech ha'olam, the way of the world, is to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the kindness that he's done after it's completed. So someone who goes on a journey, for example, he comes back and he says, mentions Goimel. He thanks Hashem for the fact that he's been successful and the fact that he's helped him on the trip. But in the middle of the trip, you don't make you're not Mavarich, you don't make the bracha because you're still waiting for the end. So Yisro could say the bracha, could say the words Baruch Hashem on Kriyas Yam Suf, on the Melchemes Amalek, on the saving of Klal Yisrael, as if it was a complete whole thing. But the Bnei Yisrael couldn't, because they were still in the middle of the journey. They hadn't reached the point yet where they could turn and say, we've made it. They couldn't reach the point where they could, so to speak, bench Gomo, right? They were still in the middle. They knew that the whole purpose was to get to Har Sinai. The whole idea was Kabbalah Satorah. And until then, they were not yet in a place where they could say those words, Baruch Hashem. But even so, that there is still a criticism upon them that they should have reached this point and stopped and reflected and turned around and said Baruch Hashem, and that they didn't do, and that was the element of themselves. Even though there was a justification in the sense that they were still on the journey, they hadn't reached the main point, and therefore that's why they didn't do it. But there was still a claim against them effectively. And he says you have to say this, otherwise, with all the Gemara and Brachas, for example, the person experiences we learn from this posuk of Yisro, this posuk, that you make a bracha on a nace, you experience a miracle, you say Baruch Asher Asa Nace Mokum Hazeh, right? We learn it from this posuk. How is it possible they didn't do so? So they must have had this justification, but even so, there is some claim against them. And I think we see from here the idea that we can sometimes be in a position where we feel that the Yeshua, or the thing we're waiting for, the final, if you like, salvation, is not yet here. So we're not yet quite ready to say those words, Baruch Hashem. But the Mechilta, the Medrash, is telling us, and from the claim against Klal Yisrael, that Yisro, who was an outsider, saw it as a complete thing in and of itself and expressed that word. It's a lesson for us that sometimes we can be in the middle of something, we think we're not there. But when it's complete, then I'll express the words Baruch Hashem. But actually, we learn from here that really one has to stop sometimes and say, this is a Yeshua. This is a salvation, and that's a moment to express gratitude to Hashem. It's a very important idea in the sensitivities and how to develop and build that personal connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When we move forward, you test Gimel, there is a question which the Emes Yaakov deals with. He says that a number of times in the introductory psukim in the parsha that introduces Matan Torah, you find there's very specific ideas given to Moshe Rabbeinu as to how he is supposed to express his the messages to the Bnei Yisrael, right? So 1 second, let me just find this. Here it is. So he says, second. So Yutes Gimel, it says, so Rashi says, when it says, Moshe Allah Elohim vayikroy Hashem and Hashem called him, saying, Koso malaves Yaakov sakid of Israel. This is what you should say. And Rashi says, Beloshen hazeh ukeseda hazeh. You have to say it with these words and in this precise order. And you find the same thing if you look in Pasuk Vov, where it says, right? It says, "Va'atem tiyulim amleches kohenim v'goy kodesh." All the words we're very familiar with. Eila hadvarim. You see the emphasis again. Eila hadvarim asher tlevel b'nei Yisrael. This is what you need to say to the Bnei Yisrael. Rashi again emphasizes the same thing, right? What is it? Lo pochas v'lo yos, neither less neither more. Now ask yourself the obvious question, right? Why was he going to deviate? Why is the emphasis need to be again and again? You have to say exactly this. Don't say less. Don't say more. It wasn't likely to deviate from what Hashem had told him to do, right? So why was it here? This is emphasized so much. So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky says like this. We know the famous score in Shabbos, which says that the mountain was suspended over them, Kofar Aleim Har Kegigis, and in that sense there was this idea of being forced to accept the Torah. Tosfos asks there that we know they already said Nasa v'Nishma. So we're going to do it, right? So why did they have to have this element of force? What's going on? And Tosfos says, "Shema yu choizrim kashiyiru heishagedola sheyotzon ishmosim." When they saw the great fire, they might change their minds. They might go back. They might say, "Actually, this is not for us. This is too much of a threat. It's not something we can take." And Rabbi Yaakov says that we can explain this based on the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which says that you're not allowed to be ka'avodim. You shouldn't be ka'avodim ashamshon esarav. Don't do things for a reward. And the Mishnah says, Mora Shamayim Aleichem. And you have to have Mora Shamayim. You have to have fear of heaven. And he says, Yaakov says that in his parish in Pirkei Avos, he says that really we need both things. We need avodah from ahava, serving Hashem from love. We also need avodah from yira. It's always a balance. You need both yira and ahava. You can't have one without the other. right? Both from a perspective of fear and also from love. Because sometimes that relationship based on ahava, love alone, is not enough. And sometimes we need the yira components. And therefore, even though the Bnei Israel had accepted the Torah from ahava, which is the essence of Na'aseh v'Nishma, we will do, we're here, we're ready, right? They nevertheless still needed the component of yira, right? And that's the concept, very important idea, of Aish, of fire, right? In other words, there's that component always associated with Matan Torah as well. In this parasha, it's emphasized, and it's also, of course, emphasized in Boaz Chana a lot. Min hashamayim ishmecha es koleli asreka, right? He made you hear his voice. To Yisurin is like to afflict. That's what the word means, right? To warn you. The Esor Ishoy Hagedola and his great fire. You know what? And the answer is because here we have in this week's parasha Eshan Hakivshan, like the smoke of the furnace. You know, because without this, right? Without this, it doesn't work. The balance in Av and Yira. And we know that the other nations of the world claim that had you done this to us, had you come with such great threats to us, you'd also suspended the mountain over us, we also would have accepted it, right? The Gemara says that Avodah Zarah, Klum, they will say, the nations of the world, Klum Kofisol in Hakagigis, had you suspended the mountain over us, we also would have accepted it. And the answer is they would have accepted it, but then it would be entirely from Yira. It would be an acceptance from fear alone, and that also doesn't work. You have to have the Ava component as well. Bnei Yisrael accepted the Torah from Ava themselves, and the suspension of the mountain over their heads was so that they would also accept it from Yira. So they would understand they have to have both components. And that's the critical idea. And he says like this, that with this we can understand why it is that there's an emphasis here on Moshe Rabbeinu, that the words have to be to Klal Yisrael exactly as Hashem has given them. Because if Moshe Rabbeinu, the concern was, if Moshe Rabbeinu would, if you like, try and, even a little bit, just subtly, sort of convince them in a way to accept the Torah, you know, some because they were moved or because of his own personal influence, right? If it wasn't through an internal recognition and understanding that they worked on themselves, then it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be something which it would be effectively, it would be an acceptance which wouldn't be purely through these roots in Ava and Yira. It would come from something else. He brings in the footnotes here, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Drosha Saran, where the Ran says that's why, interesting pshat, why Moshe Rabbeinu was kavad peh. Why was Moshe Rabbeinu hard of speech? Because if Moshe Rabbeinu was the world's greatest orator, what would happen? What would happen? There would always be the concern that because of his clarity of speech, his ability to convince and to carry them along with him, that was the main reason they went with him. And that's why he was hard of speech, so that they wouldn't come for that reason. And this was also, he says, a test of Moshe Rabbeinu himself, how faithful he would be to hand over the Torah could be transmitted through him, because clearly he wanted them to accept the Torah, all right? And logically, he would have should have perhaps have taken the position, or could have taken the position, that he would add elements to himself of convincing them, this is right for you, this is what you should do, this is going to be fantastic, this is why we've made this journey. But that would detract from it, because then, if that would be the case, if he would change anything, it wouldn't come directly through the reasons themselves, their own working on it themselves, coming to it through these concepts of Ava and Yira, and that would be a very big concern. He goes on to explain, which we don't really have time to see. He goes on to explain that's why he was taken to task so much with the Memoriva, because the same idea, because there was a slight deviation specifically with Moshe Rabbeinu. In that role of transmission of the Torah, he had to be exactly clear and exactly the same as what he was transmitting, right? In order that it should entirely be the acceptance of the Torah should entirely be in the right way and through that connection with Hashem, and not because of any external convincing. Now, Rav Hirsch says on the first that says Rav Hirsch says, he says there's a distinction. He brings this earlier on as well earlier on in the Sefer Shmos, What is the difference between the word Anochi, right, and Ani? There's a difference between those two words, right? Here it doesn't say Ani Hashem Elokecha, it says Anochi Hashem Elokecha. What is the difference? So he says, Ani is all about like the I. It's the personality of the speaker, as opposed to the one being spoken to. That's what Ani is. It's all about the I, right? The Ani, okay? And Anochi, he says, is the speaker is revealed as someone who is intimately close to the person being spoken to. The word Anochi is able to encompass, it's able to bear, it's able to support, he says, the person being addressed. Through speaking to another person, that is how that person becomes secure. He builds his existence through being spoken to. So it's an intimate connection. So what Rav Hirsch says is you have to understand, he says, with the entire world shaking, with the beginning, the commencement of the Aseret HaDibros, Hashem declares himself as Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? It's at the same moment, he turns to every single individual Jew and says, I am your Anochi, right? I have a personal relationship with you. Anochi Hashem Elokecha in the singular. I am your personal God. I have a personal relationship with you. And he says like this, he says very powerful words which are beautifully conveyed in the translation of Rav Hirsch. As people know, the best way they say, those who speak High German, is apparently to learn Rav Hirsch in the original German, but there were two translations. There was the original translation of Rav Hirsch into English. It's quite difficult language, but the more recent translation that was done, I don't know when it was, maybe 15 years ago or something, in another translation into English, it's done very beautifully, very clear language. And it says like this, and read you a few lines. There's what the philosophers, ancient and modern, call the belief in the existence of God, is as remote as can be from the meaning of this pasuk regarding the foundations of Jewish thought and Jewish life. The fundamental truth of Jewish life, he says, is not belief in God's existence, nor that God is one and only one. It is rather that the one and only God, the God of truth, is my God. That's what the first Toras Chaim is saying. That there's a personal relationship, that he created and formed me, and he gave me standing. He told me my duty, and continues to create and form me, etc., etc. And he goes on to explain what that means. The idea being that we are not a chance product of the universe, which was first brought into being, but it's a continuous connection. The point, he says, is not that we are aware of Hashem's existence, but the awareness and acknowledgement that he is my God, that idea, and that he establishes the basis of everything that I do, and therefore he says the factual basis underlying that is Asher Tzisicha Eretz Mitzrayim, right? Because that proves it. That demonstrates, right? Demonstrates that personal connection. The fact that we can turn and say, I can prove we are standing here at Har Sinai, and we can prove we have that relationship because he took us out of Mitzrayim. So we have that personal relationship. That's what he did for us. And that is the idea, says Rav Hirsch, this concept, the concept of Anochi that exists at the heart of the Aseret HaDibros. The Malbim has a slightly different perspective on the words Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and he says it's based on a Pesikta, on a Medrash Pesikta Rav Kana. What is the word Anochi meant to convey? So the Medrash says, "Lefisha nira lehen HaKadosh Baruch Hu bayam kegibor osem milchama." By the sea, he's like a mighty warrior doing battle. The nira lehem b'Sinai kasofer melamed tanah, like a, so to speak, a scribe, like a giving over the Torah. The nira lehem b'Doniel kazokim melamed Torah. Other times, the time of Daniel, Hashem appears, so to speak, as a zokin, an elderly person. Melamed obviously does not speak language we can understand. Melamed Torah. Nira lahem b'mei Shlomo Bochor, time of Shlomo, like someone younger. It's not, don't get confused. It's all me. Right? That the idea being, says the Malbim, that there's a distinction. He says, Yesh hevdel bein ani or bein anochi. It's another perspective from Rav Hirsch. What is the difference between ani and anochi? If you say, he says, ani omed, say I'm standing, that means I'm not sitting. If you say anochi omed, it means I and not someone else. In other words, In other words, the idea of Anochi means it's only I. That's what Anochi conveys, right? It's me and no one else. That's what the word Anochi denotes, as opposed to I. That's how he understands it. So in other words, what the word Anochi here is trying to convey is a message to the Bnei Yisrael: do not get confused by the different things that I have done. The fact that I have saved you from Mitzrayim, like Gibor Alayam, and now I'm giving you the Torah Anochi. It's all I. It's all me, as we say on Seder night. Anochi ani hu v'lo acher. We say ani, but it's I and no one else. That's the idea. So that's the Malbim. And finally, if we look at the slightly different idea, but perhaps something that underpins something critical to the whole parsha. If you go towards the very end of the parsha, why is it? It seems ostensibly out of place. What is the description of the Mizbeach? Yeah, Mizbeach doing at the end of Parshas Yisro before the idea, and before anything about the Mishkan has even been described, right? The last two psukim of the parsha, right? Last few psukim, Mizbach Adom Taseli, etc., and then Pasuk of base, Ve'im Mizbach Avonim Taseli. If you make for me a Mizbach Avonim, and as Rashi brings, this is not an option. This has to be. This will happen. Lo sivnes and gozis. You can't make it out of hewn stone. If you wave your sword over it, then you will have profaned it. And finally, last pasuk in the parsha, you shall not go up with steps on my mizbeach, because that causes one to widen with one's steps. It's a form of gilui erva, revealing nakedness, and therefore it has to be through a slope. And the question here is obvious. Why are these psukim here? What is the connection? Why does the Parsha Matan Torah end in this way? And one perspective that's given by a number of different Mefarshim in different ways is that these psukim are obviously, they have the literal meaning that they're referring to, the mitzvahs that they're referring to, the mizbeach and how the mizbeach was meant to be built, and the ramp, etc., right? But it also conveys a fundamental concept about humility. So that if you look at the Kli Yakar, if you've got Mikras Gedolos, the Kli Yakar explains this. It's the last Kli Yakar on the parsha. He says, this comes to tell us Shirotza Hashem laharos b'mizbeach zeh, that Hashem wanted to demonstrate through this mizbeach in Yonei Anova, concepts of humility. V'hacherev in Yonei Hagava. The whole idea of a sword is pride. That's what the sword represents. The sword is your pride. So you see, the sword is the symbol of strength, of might, of pride. And therefore, says the Kli Yakar, the waving of the sword profanes the Mizbeach. And it concludes, the Torah concludes this idea and this concept, this theme of humility with the final pasuk, which is, do not go up in steps on the Mizbeach. The going up steps is jumping really from one level to the next. The yesh ba'aliyazu derech ge'ah v'go'ah. There is like it's a form of pride. It's a form of confidence in the wrong way, right? Of haughtiness. That's what the idea of going up steps implies. It's not possible that on the way up to perform the korbanos and to do the avodah, which is the theme is zivchei elokim ruach nishbara, that what Hashem wants and the sacrifices, that the best sacrifice, the sacrifices that Hashem wants from us is the ruach nishbara, is the broken heart, is the idea that we are cognizant of our mortality and of our lowliness, if you like, right? That enables us to grow in life. And that's the idea of avodah. How can you serve Hashem if you're jumping up steps to get there? It's completely the wrong perspective. V'nosan tam ladovar, and it gives a reason for it. Because how are you going to explain the last? You should not reveal your nakedness. What does that mean? Of course, the mikra means the simple explanation, because that is the problem with the steps. Nevertheless, there's also a hint. Pride, it's like pride comes before the fall, right? It's pride and haughtiness which lead or have within them, tragically, the concept of gilui erva, of revealing of immorality. Anyone who has pride, who lords himself over others, it's as if they've had forbidden relationships. And even more drastically, or if you like, Chazal say, anyone who has pride, who prides himself, lords himself over others, he can tragically stumble with an ashes ish, even a married woman. So the idea is that the end, according to the Kliyakar, of course we have the simple explanation of the Psukim, but also convey to us, the Torah finishes off the Parsha of Matan Torah with understanding that the critical approach we need to avodah. Remember, this is the way up to the Mizbeach. This is how the Mizbeach is formed. The sword is separate, and the aliyah going up to the Mizbeach is through a slope and not through steps. To understand that the key is anova, the key is humility. If a person goes through life with that sense of constantly talev amalos, always they're jumping up steps in an incorrect way, right? In an incorrect way, in a haughty and prideful way, that can lead tragically to the consequences even as severe as lo sigala ervos chalov. There's an idea that's brought b'shem. There's a very Hasidic thought on the idea of the Noam Elimelech, and the Noam Elimelech explained the last pasuk in the parsha, v'lo saleh v'malos al mizbechi, because if you are taleh b'malos, those who try to always go up, they risk more and more, to be megala erva, that their shortcomings and their deficiencies can be revealed. In other words, it's a risky business, right? Because you see this in contemporary society. The higher people go in society, the more of a risk. It's an astonishingly insightful pshat, right? The higher up you go, right, the more likely there will be a gilui erva, not necessarily just in terms of morality, just a revealing of deficiencies, of places that go wrong. So I think this brings together perhaps beautifully these ideas together, that the parsha and the ways we can understand how this parsha provides a pathway towards developing that personal connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and understanding also critically from the end of the parsha that the key to achieving and the key to actually going upwards is through a sense of genuine anova. Something we have to all work on. Okay. Yeah. Have a good Shabbos. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Okay.